This week, we'll be discussing poverty in the United States. The first thing to consider is, why do we have poor people in the United States? We are one of the richest countries in the world. Why can we not have proper income for everyone? So there's various theories on why we have poor people, and these have evolved over time. So we can kind of think about these theories in relation to the values and the social work history that we discussed in previous weeks. The first older theory is called the culture of poverty. So this was developed in the 1960s. And it is the idea that there are character flaws or individual deficits that causes individuals to be in poverty. So specifically the idea that, individuals who are in poverty are hopeless, they're apathetic, they lack motivation to pull themselves out of poverty. So this is considered an outdated view on poverty because it's blaming the victim. So it's saying that people are in poverty because it's their own fault that they're in poverty. And it's rather outdated. There's also the idea of eugenics. So the idea of eugenics was started in the early 1900s, primarily around like the 1920s. And it was kind of brought up again in the 1990s with the book, The Bell Curve. So eugenics is the thought that people in poverty are there because they have lower IQ. So they have lower intelligence, and because they have lower intelligence, they have found themselves in lower paying jobs that kind of require them to be in poverty. So those are two outdated views. The more contemporary or progressive view is the idea that there's a lack of resources, that social structures make it so that individuals do not have the resources to pull themselves out of poverty. So if you think of inadequate schools that vary based on if you're in a high income or low income neighborhood, inadequate healthcare also varies by neighborhood. And because of these inadequate resources, individuals are kind of find themselves in poverty. An extension of this view is the idea of an intergenerational cycle of poverty. So because of this lack of resources, the social structures, poverty kind of perpetuates from one generation to the next. So we've definitely seen over time that, kids who are born into poverty are much more likely to be in poverty as adults. Now, this isn't to say that because you're born into poverty, you're necessarily going to stay in poverty. But the majority of individuals born into poverty do continue to find themselves in poverty as adults. So the exception for someone to be in poverty is to pull themselves out. It is not the norm, which is problematic because the average person should have the same resources as an average person who's in a high income family. So the next thing we consider is who is poor. And these will be discussed in more detail in two short videos that you'll watch for class this week. So poverty rates are based on the federal poverty level. So the 2021 federal poverty level, if you're a single individual, is $12,880. So if you're a single individual working a full-time minimum wage job, you'd be making about $15,000 an hour. So the minimum wage for a single individual is fairly similar to the federal poverty level. But the thing to keep in mind is that a minimum wage is not the same as a living wage. So there is a short reading that discusses the living wage in more detail. A living wage takes into account all of these costs. So you have cost of food, childcare, health, housing, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. And it also varies by location. Whereas the minimum wage, the minimum wage, there's a federal minimum wage, and then minimum wage can vary by state or city. But these federal poverty levels, which kind of mirror the minimum wage, don't vary by location. With the exception of Alaska and Hawaii, there are separate federal poverty levels for those areas. Someone in New York who makes $13,000 a year would not be considered to be living in poverty. Someone who lives in Kansas who makes $13,000 a year would also not be considered to be in poverty. However, the cost of living is very different in those two states. So the living wage takes into account differences by location. So individuals living in higher cost area are going to require more money to meet their basic needs. So just because you have a minimum wage job that puts you above the federal poverty level does not mean that you can afford all of your basic needs. You're still going to be living paycheck to paycheck, and you're still going to be struggling. Some trends we've seen in poverty over time. The first is poverty rates have actually been declining over the past decade. So that is positive. In 2020, the poverty rate was 9.2%. In 2019, the year before, it was, I believe, 10.6%. So it is on the decline, which is positive. However, we've also seen that there's growing income inequality between the rich and the poor. So that is still problematic. So the rich keep getting richer and the poor are staying about the same. So for example, in 1967, the Americans who had the highest incomes had 11 times as much money as individuals who were in the poorest group. I mean, this is taking out like those outliers, like taking out all those billionaires, but in general, the average richest Americans were making about 11 times higher than the poorest Americans. In 2017, that income gap had grown to 17 times. So the average of the richest Americans were making 17 times more than the poorest average Americans. The other thing to keep in mind is that there's increased cost of basic needs for poor people. Despite the fact that poverty rates have declined, poor people are spending more of their income on basic needs than higher income individuals. That's because if we think about, there's something called the poor tax, which you'll learn more about in your reading this week. But it's the idea that certain basic needs cost more for poor people. For example, car insurance and home insurance are higher if you live in a high crime neighborhood. So high crime neighborhoods tend to be low income as well. So if you're low income and you have to live in a high crime neighborhood because that's all you can afford, you're going to end up paying more in car insurance and home insurance because there's a higher likelihood of a break-in. You also have to pay higher banking fees if you can't meet like a minimum balance. Like a lot of banks, you have to pay a monthly account maintenance fee if you don't have so much in your bank account. And lower income individuals don't have as much in their bank account. Additionally, if you're living in some low income neighborhoods, don't have a lot of access to grocery stores. So if you're buying all of your groceries at the local convenience store, like a Family Dollar or a Dollar Tree or other small convenience stores, it's actually more expensive to buy them at these smaller convenience stores than at larger grocery stores. And larger grocery stores are less likely to be in low-income neighborhoods because it's not as profitable for grocery stores. And grocery stores are about making a profit. So the amount that individuals spend in basic needs it's higher, and it's just an increased cost. You have this added tax because of being poor. The other thing we've kind of seen, again, despite the fact that poverty rates have been declining, there's still several groups that do have significantly increased poverty rates. So here this looks at differences in poverty rates by group. So what percent of that group are in poverty? We see that African Americans and Hispanics are about twice as likely as whites to be in poverty. Individuals with lower levels of education are more likely to be in poverty. Children are more likely to be in poverty. So if we look at it by age, kids are the most likely to be in poverty, which is really concerning. So older adults are the least likely to be in poverty, and that's because the U.S. has a great program called Social Security. So previously it was kind of flipped. So previously older adults were more likely to be in poverty. Now it's kids. So that is really concerning. Individuals with a disability are really have high rates of being in poverty. And individuals who live in single parent households headed by a mom have the highest rate of being in poverty. So almost half of single parent households headed by a mom are in poverty. So what does the U.S. do to kind of combat poverty? The U.S. has a variety of programs to help pull people out of poverty. We'll be discussing each of these programs later in the semester. We'll kind of go through them each week we'll have a different topic that we'll be discussing. We have Social Security. So Social Security is targeted towards older adults. So Social Security is the reason that we don't have as many older adults in poverty. We have tax credits. So when you file your taxes, if you are low income or if you have kids, you receive a special tax credit. So that can help pull people out of poverty. That gives people, that's really the most successful anti-poverty program that we have, is the earned income tax credit. We have SNAP or food stamps. We have supplemental security income, which is it's welfare for low-income individuals and specifically people with disabilities. And there's temporary assistance for needy families. And that's abbreviated TANF, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. So that's welfare for families. And again, we can look at how successful have these different anti-poverty programs have they been, and we measure success based on the number of people it pulls out of poverty. So this is the idea that if you are an older adult and your income is $12,000, you're a single older adult. So $12,000 as a single adult would be slightly below the poverty level. So you're in poverty. But when you receive your Social Security check, your income is now $14,000. You'd be pulled out of poverty. So what it looks at, when we look at the change, it's what would your income be without this anti-poverty program, and what is it with it? Are you above the poverty level once you get that anti-poverty program taken into consideration? So Social Security each year pulls about 27 million people out of poverty. And most of those individuals it's pulling out of poverty are older adults, because the program itself is targeted towards older adults. Refundable tax credits are pulling 8 million people out of poverty. SNAP or food stamps is pulling 3 million, as is supplemental security income. So those are the most effective ways to pull them out. Refundable tax credits is actually the most effective. You don't see it in this chart. It doesn't pull out as many people as Social Security, but if you look at how much money we're spending on Social Security, it's far greater than the amount that we're spending on refundable tax credits. So if we're thinking about the greatest bang for our buck, it would be refundable tax credits, because they are targeted towards low-income individuals in particular. Pretty much everyone over the age of 65 receives Social Security, as long as you worked throughout your lifetime. So because it's targeted towards both high-income and low-income individuals, it's not quite as bang for our buck as refundable tax credits are. So what else can the U.S. be doing? Along with these anti-poverty programs that we already have, what else should we be doing? The first is to consider raising the minimum wage to a living wage. And this is really putting it in the hands of state and local governments to raise the minimum wage, because the living wage varies so much by area. For having local state governments recognizing that, $7.25 an hour is not enough to live in your area and to cover your basic needs. So increasing those basic wages. The U.S. also needs more high quality jobs, full-time jobs with benefits. One trend in U.S. jobs over the past few decades is we've had more low-wage jobs and more part-time jobs. So about a third of Americans work a part-time job, or about a third of jobs are part-time. So that means they don't have benefits. And a lot of people are finding themselves kind of working multiple part-time jobs just to make ends meet. So we need more high quality jobs that are going to allow individuals to cover their basic needs. We also need increased access to social welfare services. If we think about that cycle of poverty, one reason the cycle of poverty occurs is because of a lack of access to high quality services, specifically quality education. So education varies. The type of education you receive varies so much based on where you live, what neighborhood you're in. If you're in a low income area, you're not going to receive as high quality education as if you're in a high income area. Healthcare varies by neighborhood. We need more affordable housing. We need better childcare options for families, more affordable childcare, because we want to simply get everyone on a level playing field. If we have everyone on a level playing field with access to education, healthcare, housing, childcare, and many other services, then we can really break that cycle of poverty.